Mike and I are on Roxalana Road where we lived about 1920, 80 years ago. He's taking a picture of the drain, the little creek that comes, branch that comes off the hill. Uh, but the house, the house was beside that branch, but I'm sure it was back near to where the camera is sitting now because the road meandered in and out of the creek, and the house and the barn and the garden were all beside of the creek, Tyler Creek, that runs by this place right here.
All right, and who was Grandpa Eric in partnership with?
Ed Dodd.
And where was his dairy?
Dad's dairy.
Yes.
This is Roxalana, and the dairy was right over there, just east of where that branch comes off the hill.
All right, and where was Ed Dodd's dairy?
Old man Ed Dodd had a place up on Crescent Road where he had the cows down on the cutout level, on the ground level where they could walk out on the ground. He had a grocery store in the middle level that walked out on Crescent Road, and he lived in the third story on top of that at the mouth of what they call Magazine. Then it's now Garrison Avenue.
All right, and what children would have been alive when you lived here in 1920?
Clement, Robert, and Orville, for sure, and Q was born in February 1920, so I assume that he was the baby. However, Q was born up the road toward Charleston from here.
All right, and how? Tell me that story about walking to find the cow that day.
Well, I was 6, 7 years old, and it was my job to hunt the cows and bring them in. And one cow was missing, and Dad told me to hunt her. And when he came back from delivering the milk, he asked me about the cow, and I told him that I went all the way to where I could see the railroad tracks, and I couldn't find the cow. So he thought I was telling a fib about walking so far. So that's all there was to it. He relented, let me go.
So where would those railroad tracks be? Is that where modern Dunbar Railroad is today?
That's what I'm talking about, walking over that hill there toward Dunbar and looking down into the railroad tracks.
So you walked all the way up Roxalana Road, over top of the hill, down into the valley,
yeah,
and down into where the railroad railroad tracks are now in modern day Dunbar, looking for that cow in 1920. And that was all, was that a road then, or just a track?
Well, there was a road here.
Yeah.
And I don't know about the roads at Dunbar, but at that time, the only paved road out of Charleston came down What's Washington Street and down to right out there to Forks of the Road, where you go either to Tyler or Dunbar. It was a brick road. And it was there yet when we moved to Dunbar.
Well, now, for you to walk from here, Roxalana Road, back to Dunbar, would that have been, was there a path? Or were you just walking through the woods?
Well, I was in the woods, of course. I don't know. I don't remember. Of course, there's a way, cow tracks and the way animal trails, the way you pick your way through, and probably most of it was cleared and farmed in those days.
Uh-huh.
But the road meandered in and out of this creek. I remember the woman that lived right out there on the point east of here, 100 yards, was a school teacher. And I'd see her every day drive a Model T Roadster. She had a very big black hat. And when Christine and I moved to Dunbar, I went out there and talked with her. And she remembered the hat. Her name was Mrs. Wilson.
So how long you lived here in the 1920s? About from when did you move here and when did you leave?
Well, I think we were just here, say like one summer.
One summer.
Yeah, and that had to be 1920, going by the fact that Q was born in 1920, but he wasn't born. He wasn't born right here. I think we had lived at the Pop place, and and then moved out here, but we moved back to the Pop place. And I'll tell you about that when we get up to the Pop place.
All righty. All right, we'll head up there now.
We moved up to the Pop place, and then we and in 1924, Dad sold the dairy and moved across to South Charleston. And we're not going over there, but when we get up here where the locks were, the locks on the Canal River were right around the corner there. And when we get there, I'm going to point it out to Mike from the truck, because you know there's no use to stop. It's just a place on the other side that we live from. We had Christmas at the Pop Plate, the best Christmas we ever had. As far as toys are concerned, I got a BB gun and a pair of skates, and so we moved over there in January and moved away April the 23rd, 1924. Let me explain to this.
That comes down from Dunbar, runs along the river into Charleston, and Uncle Clement is now going to point out where the family moved to on the other side of the river in South Charleston.
There was a lock here, a navigational river lock right here, called Lock 6, and we lived right near the government houses over there where the lockmaster lived, and the working house on this side of the river. We're parked about 200 yards from where the road forks, and one fork goes to Powder Mountain, the other fork crosses the railroad and goes into Dunbar. Mike has taken the picture of the place where we moved to from the Pop place, which we'll talk about later. He's getting the picture over there because that's where we lived from January to April, when we moved away from South Charleston and moved to Wills Creek.
And what year was that? You moved?
1924 we moved.
Okay, moved to Wills Creek from this location across the river in 1924.
Yeah, Mommy went up to Aunt Hattie's at Wilson Station. That's where Connor's greenhouse is. She spent the night with Aunt Hattie, and then we came up the next day with the team and wagon and cow, and we spent the night. And the next morning, Dad and I got the wagon going at daylight, and Mommy rode the train to Blue Creek, and Temple Border came to Blue Creek with the team and buggy and got her. And it took us to go from Connor's greenhouse to Grandma's on Wills Creek. We started at daylight, which was probably 6 o'clock, and it was almost 6 o'clock when we got there. 12 hours to go from Connor's greenhouse to Elkview Flame Interchange, 3 miles beyond that.
But you were pulling a wagon and going very slow, right?
I had a team of horses and had a cow tied to the wagon.
So you were going very slow.
Slowly.
If you had to go by horseback or walk, it wouldn't have taken you 12 hours, right? You could have walked in a lot less time?
Well, you could walk it maybe a couple of hours.
Really?
Shorter.
Okay.
Riding. But the point is that it took us 12 hours to go where you could do now in less than 12 minutes.
It took 12 hours to go on horse with a wagon and a pair of horses pulling a cow behind you. Took 12 hours to go a distance that now it would take, with the modern road system, 12 minutes to do. Isn't that amazing?
Probably less.
Isn't that amazing? All right, well, we're off now to see the next location.
Mike and I are now in what used to be Dogtown. It's the road on which
Start over. We're in Dogtown, North Charleston.
We are now in Dogtown, North Charleston. We're standing beside of what used to be, when we lived up here, the only paved road out of Charleston on this side of the river, a brick road that ran from Charleston down to the intersection of the Dunbar and the Catamount Road, and this road was brick here until 1950 because I brought Lou home from the hospital on it, and then they built the 4-lane down there. It's called 7th Avenue or Washington Street. I'm not sure about the address. We always refer to this place as the Pop place because a man named Pop owned it. You hear me?
Yep.
So this is also stop 6 on the Charleston-Dunbar streetcar line. That's the way you identified your address in those days, stop 6 or stop 5 or stop 1. But then, of course, it was confused with lock 6, which I talked about a while ago on the Canal River. Many things happened here. Just opposite us is what was a rock wall, and if Michael turned the camera left a little bit, you can still see the wall standing up. Now, we used to ride a wagon down that hill and coast it, and then turn it when we got down before we jumped over the wall. But once Orville got in that wagon, and he was always into something, so he got in that wagon and came straight over the hill and jumped over that rock wall and landed out in the street. And when I saw him, a man was picking him up and was carrying him back. He was going to carry him up to the house. And of course, I got him. He wasn't really hurt, but there's enough escapades that happened here that I could talk for a week. Incidentally, we had a shepherd dog that everybody loved, and he got out here and got hit by a car, and we buried him right over there, about 50 yards over there against that bank under a big pear tree. Now, this house was an old brick house. They said was pre-Civil War. Maybe it had a hospital in it during the Civil War, and it was kind of ghostly and mysterious. And I was afraid myself to go up in the attic, but somebody went up in there with me one day, and we found mannequins, you know, where the women used to sew with, and just things like that. You imagine ghost stories. But the feature of that house was that against that hill, somebody had leveled off a place as level could be, and put a dirt parapet all the way around it, and that was done so they could use it to play croquet. Well, we lived here. Q was born here in February 6, 1920. Shaw was born here February 20th, 1923. And we lived here at 2 different times, and that's where I get mixed up is the sequence. But I know that one of those times we moved from that place on Roxland Road up here because Fisher and Fisher, the butcher shop, had bought that place on Roxland Road and built a slaughterhouse there after we moved away. I've lost my train of thought there. Anyway, we lived here at two different times, and from here we moved, as I've already told you, across the river in South Charleston there, and where her dad, when he left here, he decided that he would go into buying and selling cattle. And after a few trips, like walking all the way to Buffalo, or getting a ride with somebody in a wagon or whatever, and then walking back to South Charleston, I don't think he liked buying and selling the cattle well. So we took Bonnie's inheritance and traded it to Uncle Con and Aunt Hattie for a farm over on Willow Street that was back of Grandpa Humphreys' farm. And I want to say for that farm that anybody who really stuck to it and farmed could have made a living on that place. It was 85 acres, had 5 or 6 benches of level land, and it was absolutely fertile, a very good place to live. But now it's all cut up with all field roads, so it's even ugly nowadays. So anyway.
Now let me ask you that the house set right up there on the bench that we're looking at. Is that right?
That's right. Just up
okay.
on the level.
Okay, so the house set right up there, and it was an old brick house that dated back to the Civil War.
That's right.
And you would have lived there in about 1920?
Well, we lived there in 1920 because Q was born there.
Yep.
We lived there in 1923 because Charlotte was born there.
And they were actually born in the house?
Yes.
Actually.
And did I tell you about having the best Christmas there?
Well, tell us that story again.
Okay. The dad sold the dairy there in the fall of 1923. Of course, he had a little money, and as far as toys are concerned, that was probably our greatest Christmas. For instance, I got a BB gun, and I got a pair of skates, as well as all the other things, oranges and apples and firecrackers and things like that they always gave us. And then in January, we moved across to the South Charleston place.
All right. Now, since you just mentioned it, why don't you explain to the family watching this videotape about when you used the expression, they took Bonnie's inheritance and bought the farm on Wills Creek. Tell us how that worked.
Well, of course, you know, Grandma, I mean, mine.
Your mother.
My mother.
Liddy.
And Con's wife, Hattie, were sisters.
Okay.
And they inherited from Grandpa Brookman.
Okay.
That is their grandpa, my great-grandpa. They were in his will, and they inherited, and they took, when they decided to move to Wills Creek, they took my mother's share and traded it to Con for the farm that we moved on to, where all of you walked back there to that house that time, which had been burned down.
Okay. All right. And do you have any, you were a little boy then, do you have any idea how much that inheritance was worth, what that share was?
I think it was $1,500.
$1,500, which is a sizable amount of money in those days. Sizable amount of money. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to go from the house here, and we're going to walk down the street, and there's a street that you can see in the distance there, and up that street, which is now a paved road that leads to houses, was the path up to where the yellow truck is coming out, was the path up to where the pasture was and where the horse pen was, and we're going to take a walk up there. We've now walked down the street past where the rock wall was and have come up a street called North Arthur Road, and This is now called Washington Heights, as you can see. And it was up this track that the pasture and the horse pen and the cow pen was, which Clement will now tell us about.
Calf. It was the calf
Calf pen,
right here.
right here.
I mean, you ready for me to talk?
I'm ready. Go ahead, start talking.
Okay, we're standing right here where we put the calves when they got big enough to take them out of the barn, called the calf pen, but they also would let the horses in there because they had to have horses to deliver the milk. My dad would leave here every morning with the milk loaded in a wagon and go to Charleston to Court Street, where Lewis Brothers had an operation that I can't think of the right pasteurized, a plant that pasteurizes the milk, and those men that sold the milk to that place would try to beat one would try to beat the other one there so he could get his milk unloaded and get back home to do his work at home. And there used to be a fellow that lived around on Tyler that had a few cows. His name was Chet Nichols, and he would go by here, and he had a buckboard that had a wheel out of line on it. When that wheel would turn over, it would jerk the back of his buckboard. You could just sit and watch him regularly. It looked like it would jerky load right off there. And Dad was always trying to beat Chuck Nichols to Court Street from here. Now, what else you want? This road that you see, when we lived here, was naturally a dirt road about 10 feet wide that went up here about 50 yards and turned right and went back around above the house. And that's the way we came up here. We hauled feed up here, hauled coal, and all the things we needed, we hauled right up this hill and around the house. I remember an old man tried to haul coal up here. He had two poor little skinny horses that hadn't had enough to eat all winter, and they got stuck right here. And he whipped them, and he said, I hate to be mean to an animal, but I'd rather when I have to, I can. But those horses couldn't move that wagon, so Dad went and got old Cap, our best horse, and hitched her to that wagon ton and pulled them on up the hill. That's one of the things I remember that happened here. In 1921, they divided this place into lots, building lots, and I went with them. I went every place Dad went. I went with him to put the cornerstones where they belong. There's lot numbers, and street numbers, things like that. We hauled them on a sled and back on that hill and dropped them off where they belong. When we lived here, there was a great apple orchard on top of the hill, and there were great, good apples all around this house and barn up here, and with pear trees also. We're now on what used to be some kind of a road through this property. Probably took you back on the hill, and the level place that you see in front of you, as far as I can tell, it's so difficult to identify specific places to the foot, but right in this vicinity is where the old brick house stood, and the croquet grounds that they'd built were just as level as could be, with the dirt parapet around them to keep the balls from going over the hill. And the barns stood out to the east of the house, 100 yards, the milk house, and all of the things that it took to run a dairy were there. And we were there from 1920, sometime in 1920 through 1923. But we lived for a while someplace in the middle there, because there were two times that we lived at the pop place. We probably moved here the first time from over on Garrison Avenue. And I think it's here we are on Pacific Street off of Garrison Avenue in what used to be Magazine Holland. This is approximately, as near as I can judge, down by the creek there is where the house and the barn and the garden were. We were here in 1921 because we walked to the top of the hill where I'm looking now and looked over toward Charleston and saw part of the smoke and so on from the burning of the state capitol.
So the top of this hill up here would have been where you would have gone to see the...
Back here against that hill where the camera was pointed now, Dad had a cornfield, and there's where Robert rode the runaway horse. Dad finished plowing and put the horse through the bars, and she just decided to go to the barn. He started hollering at her, and Mommy and I were standing on the porch, and Mommy was hollering. And one of them was yelling, "Drop off," and the other one was yelling, "Hang on." And he did hang on, which he always hung on to anything. But anyway, when the horse stopped at the barn, and I got to him, he was hanging between the tug on the horse, that leather strap that they pull loads by. He was hanging between that and the horse's body, but he was holding to the hames. So that if he'd have dropped, he'd have been hurt. Well, we were here still in partnership with Ed Dodd, and from here we moved out to the pop place where we just left.
Why did Grandpa Eric move around so much, do you think, instead of staying in one place?
Well, he didn't have anything of his own. He was a boy. See, how old would he be if I was born in 1913?
He was born in 1894, wasn't he?
Yes. Now, how old would he be in 1913? 19 years old. And so 19, we met him 26 or 27 when we lived here, and he was trying to get started, which he couldn't, you know. So that's why we moved. We moved wherever you could rent a patch of ground for a little pasture and a barn big enough for 15 or 20 cows.
Okay.
And that's a good question, and I've tried to answer that myself. And that's my conclusion, that he was just trying to get a start.
Very young man, trying to get a start in life, and had a young family.
Right.
And he was born in 1894, and also that's when Grandma Liddy was born, 1894. They were both born in 1894.
Yep. He was 6 months older.
So she was...
He born in January and she born in July.
And he died in 1944. 1944. Born in 1940, died in 1944.
Yep. We're standing at my father's grave in the Woodall Cemetery on Wills Creek at Elkview. I was just telling his great-granddaughter, no, his granddaughter back there, that a greater man
never lived, a better man never lived. He was respected by his peers. They all always said good things about him. I never knew of anybody to say a bad word about Dad unless it be some member of your family because he was very rigid and repressive and demanding of his whole family. But he was a good religious man and believed that everybody ought to do the right thing. And now we can turn to our mother who is buried beside him and say that if she had been in charge of the whole family, we'd have been better off economically and maybe otherwise. She is the spur, the person that made us all want to go to college and better ourselves. She always held that up to us that we could do better and that we ought to go to school and do the best we could. These are the graves of Grandpa and Grandma Burdett. Grandma Burdett was formerly Elizabeth James, who married Lewis Brookman. Grandma Burdett, James Burdett Brookman, or however it goes, was the mother of Hattie and Carrie and Liddy and Addie Brookman. Then when Grandpa Brookman died, she married Ed Burdett. And in the materials I have fashioned to give out, all of that is explained, how many children he had named Burdett and about Grandma's Brookman children. She was what people in those days called clever. Clever meaning hospitable. And when you go to see her, she'd stand on the front porch when you came in sight, coming through the big gate down on the main road, and start talking to you, and she'd talk to you till you got up there. And when you left, she'd stand on the porch with her hands under her apron and talk to you till she couldn't see you any longer. She was a lovable person. This is the grave of my mother's brother, Cary Brookman. He was uh, handicapped, crippled at birth, and Grandma Bartlett, or Brookman, said that when he was about 2 years old or 3, somewhere in there, he pecked on a bee gum with a hammer, and the bees just swarmed on him. And she thought that made him a worse cripple. He always had a horse to ride. He could do chores, but he had a problem with walking. He had a problem with his speech, but he was difficult to talk to him. But when he went to church and gave his testimony, as I remember, it was as clear as anyone could talk. He was just a good Christian man. Of course, he was too handicapped. He was never married, just stayed at home or visited around, mostly with his sister Evie. This is the grave of Grandma and Grandpa Woodall. Uh, William A. Woodall was the father of our grandmother, Josephine Woodall Humphreys. He came to this country and married a woman named Carter, and later, when she died, he married Martha Thaxton, who's buried here. And as I've already said, they were the parents of Josephine. They were the parents of all these Woodalls, Uncle Ev and Uncle Lawrence, Uncle Henry, all around this, this, not just around the area, the vicinity, because this is part of Grandpa Woodall's old farm right here. This part was owned by Uncle Henry and Aunt Sarah. Sarah was his daughter and Henry was his son. So he was said to be, and Uncle Ev told me this and Grandma told me this, but I couldn't find a record of it when I went to the Methodist superintendent's office there in Charleston. But he was a Methodist preacher, a circuit rider. And I remember one story that Grandma used to tell me that when they were warming tobacco, she would step up in the row behind him and listen to him talk, because he talked to himself, and one thing he would say is, it takes all I can rake and scrape to buy books. But he, as you can see, was a pretty good man and owned a lot of land in here and divided it between his children. Grandma Josephine Woodall Humphreys got 13 acres adjoining Grandpa's 26 acres just out here to the north of us, about 100 yards. And Aunt Sarah had a piece in here and a piece across the creek, across Wills Creek. And Uncle Ev had a piece over behind us to the right, abutting this cemetery. It was the land that Uncle Ev had, and Uncle Henry had the land that the cemetery is on, and some land on down the creek in the south of us.
Now, Uncle Clement, who was, say for the record here on the videotape, who Josephine Woodall was in relation to our family?
Josephine Woodall married J.J. Jacob Jr. Humphreys, my grandfather.
Okay. Now, okay, Josephine Woodall, and for a while she was up in the sanitarium at Spencer, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. This is a panorama of the Woodall Cemetery where Grandma Liddy and Grandpa Eric are buried. There's their graves that we saw earlier. And it's called the Woodall Cemetery on Wills Creek near Elkview, West Virginia. And the reason it's called the Woodall Cemetery was because it was on land owned by the Reverend A. Woodall, whose grave we just looked at, and he was the father of Josephine Woodall, who was the mother of Eric Benton Humphreys, Grandma Liddy's husband.
Here we're looking at Grandpa Humphreys and Grandma Humphreys stone. Of course, this is Jacob J., another J.J. Humphreys, and Josephine Woodall Humphreys, the mother and father of Eric Humphreys, my father, Mike's grandfather, and of course these folks are great grandfather and grandmother to Mike. They lived just over on the next farm.
This grave is Estill E. Humphreys, known as Tom Humphreys. He was the son of Jacob Jr. and Josephine Humphreys, and a brother to Eric Benton Humphreys, the husband of Liddy Humphreys. And Tom was killed in a car wreck in 1935 on Bigley Avenue. And here is the grave of William A. Humphreys, William Arthur Humphreys, who at the age of 4 years old drowned in a mill pond. And he was known as Arthur, and he was the son of Jacob Jr. and Josephine Woodall, and was a brother of Eric Benton Humphreys. This is the grave of Robert E. Humphreys, Uncle Bob, who was a brother of Eric Benton Humphreys. All right, here we are at the top of the hill looking down the cemetery. And Uncle Clement, go ahead and say what you were going to say.
Well, what I want to say is that this cemetery is on the land owned by Uncle Henry Woodall, but in the days when I was young, 16, 17, 18, 19, maybe even older than that, years old, there seldom was anyone brought up the hill through Uncle Henry's land. We came through Uncle Ev's land where we had to ford Wills Creek, and usually the vehicle that hauled the body would park on the side of Wills Creek opposite the cemetery, and the young boys would carry it across the creek. I've rolled my pants up and carried caskets across there, and I've done it without rolling my pants up and be wet up to my waist in the wintertime, and then we'd carry the casket on up the hill through Uncle Ev's property, steep as could be, on the east side of the cemetery. And then later we got a road up the hill through Uncle Henry's property, which was then owned by Deb Moulds. Got a road up that they could bring a vehicle up to the cemetery. And now, as you can see, Mike will probably turn this camera on the end of the road that we built that's left since they built the interstate, and we have a very good access to the cemetery now. You going?
I think so. Here's the Interstate 79, where it comes up through Wills Creek. Here's the road. Here's the road up to the Woodall Cemetery. And now we're pointing the camera up into the area where the family, Liddy and Eric Benton, moved in 1924. And here to talk about that is Uncle Clement.
If you point your camera right through this slot right over here, and you can see the tallest knob back there. The house we lived in was to the left of that knob and down the hill 300 feet from the top of that knob. The only way to get there was by walking, riding a horse, or riding a sled. I saw, in all the time we've been around that place up there, I saw one vehicle with wheels back there. That's where we moved in 1924. We moved from South Charleston to that particular place where there's a nice little white house with a wonderful big fireplace and a good deep well that we enjoyed so much. We kept a cider press out there with that well in the summertime, and that's where we made cider from the apples that dropped off the different trees. We had there were two wonderful orchards on that farm when we bought it, and any man that wanted to farm could have made a living right there. Now, where we're standing now is probably what we call the upper end of Grandpa Humphreys' bottom land. There was an orchard along here, and then if you turn around, just right down where this stick's pointing was Grandpa's house. It was down by the creek, and over there, that hollow, was Aunt Sarah Douglas's house. She was great-grandpa William A. Douglas's daughter, and that's the land she inherited on that side of the creek. The interstate has changed it so much. Off here to our left was bottom land that belonged to Grandpa Humphreys. That's where he raised his cane to make sorghum. They called it molasses. It was sorghum molasses that they made every year. It was a great social event. And there's so many things that happened here that it's just hard for me to keep from talking about them, but I know I'd never get it all told. So it was, in a way, a sad, wonderful life that we lived when I was a youngster.
Now, right across this gap up here, straight through there, if you walk across that hill, you come out on Riley Branch, is that correct?
That's right.
And Riley Branch is on Elk View, and that's where Grandma moved up to a farm after
The other way.
the other way?
She lived on Riley Branch, and when he died, she moved down
to Elk View. So they lived on Riley Branch, and that's on the Elk View Road, right near the a little drive-in place used to be called the Toot 'em and Tell 'em, right? Toot and Tell 'em.
Hard to find.
We're standing on the site of a log cabin that was occupied by, what were their names?
Burdette, Grandma and Grandpa Burdette.
Grandpa and Grandma Burdette. And Liddy Humphreys was born in that log cabin, and Robert Jr. Humphreys, my father, was born in that log cabin. And it stood on this site. And this is Michael. And when I was a little boy, below the age of 12, my dad and mom took the family and we went up there and we spent the night with Grandpa Burdette. And I'll never forget asking my grandfather, I mean my own father, if he thought that Grandpa Burdette had any old Civil War swords up in the attic that he'd let me play with. And on this site right here, Uncle Clement was telling us that there was an old rock Indian mound.
No,
Not rock,
here.
earth?
This is earth.
An earth Indian mound. My misunderstanding. An earth Indian mound built by the Native Americans was located on this site. In the bottom land of the creek where we came up, Uncle Clement was telling us that as a boy, when it was plowed, they found numerous arrowheads, and so Indians lived in this hollow here.
And there was a rock mound up there in the woods.
And then there was a rock mound that was further up in the woods, and
Grandpa
it
and Dad dug it out and had to quit because they didn't move the rocks far enough out.
it was dug out, but they had to quit because they didn't move the rocks far enough.
This is Nellie Burdette Cyrus. We were special, Nellie and I. We played together, played house, built furniture out of thistle blossoms when we were 10, 11, 12 years old, and then all the time that she was married, which was a long time, we didn't see a lot of each other because I was busy raising my children, she was raising her children. But she is my mother's sister. Nellie's my aunt. I'm a year older than she is, but she's still my aunt. You want to tell him anything?
I'm 86 years old.
You were born in what year?
1914.
1914. And the sister of Liddy.
Liddy.
Yeah,
Sister
Grandma
Liddy.
Liddy. And tell us a little bit about your mother and father.
George.
Your mother and father.
Grandpa Bird.
Yeah.
Where was he raised?
My dad was raised on
Jack's Fork.
yeah, on Jake's Fork.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was raised in Elkview.
Mm-hmm. And her name was?
Mary Elizabeth James.
Mary Elizabeth James. Okay. And
And she's the one that married Louis Brookman, and he died. And she married Grandpa Burdett.
mm-hmm.
And I thought more of him than I did most of the people that were related to me. I'll tell you that.
Uh-huh.
And he was a smart man.
If you look around, every one of his boys and grandchildren out here are foremen on some, wherever they're working, they're in those top labor
Mm-hmm.
positions. No white collar executives among them, but there's one of them that I know they paid him company just to get him to come back, paid him $3,700 a week and expenses.
Hmm.
So they're a smart breed.
How about the James? Is there any of the Jameses around from your mother's, on your mother's side?
No, I don't.
They're all
No.
dead.
They're all.
They're all gone. And this is because of the James connection. My sister Ann always, of course this was wrong, but she always claimed she was related to Jesse James.
Yeah.
She
They
was,
used to, yeah, they say that
but
we are a little.
not that Jesse.
Not that Jesse. The different Jesse James.
But there are three Jesse James in Grandpa James's lineage.
Mm-hmm. But not the outlaw Jesse James.
No,
All
but
right.
it's a family name
Right.
because my great 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 grandfather was Jesse James. Okay.
All right. Here we are at Elkview at the intersection of 119, which follows the Elk River up toward Clendenin from Charleston, and the road over the hill that goes to Interstate 79. Now at the intersection of these two roads is the cemetery known as Reynolds Cemetery. And this is the cemetery that we're going to visit today, where Grandpa Brookman, great-grandpa Brookman are buried. Grandpa Brookman was the father of Liddy Humphreys. All right.
This is the grave of C.S. Humphreys, known as Thad. He was my grandpa Humphrey's brother. He was the father of Colin. Now Thad Humphreys married Grandpa Brookman's daughter, Virginia, and Virginia married Thad Humphreys.
All right, and the tombstone says C.S. Humphreys, born June the 15th, 1861, died November the 5th, 1888. So he would have died being 27 years old.
Well, this is just the neatest thing I've ever.
Just to clarify this, C.S. Humphreys was the uncle of Eric Vinton Humphreys and the brother of Jacob Jr. Humphreys, Eric Vinton Humphreys' father. Eric Vinton's grandfather was known as Jacob Judy, and C.S. Humphreys would have been a son of Jacob Judy Humphreys.
And be sure to say he was referred to as Thad,
He was known as Thad.
and he married my mother's aunt, Virginia Brookman.
And he married Liddy's Aunt Virginia Brookman. Right, here we are on the side of the tombstone of C.S. Humphreys that we've just looked at, and it's marked Harriet A., wife of I.I. Humphreys, born April J.J. Humphreys, thank you, born April the 12th, 1835, and died December the 12th, 1888.
She was Jacob Judy's wife.
Harriet
After
was,
he came to this part of the country, to Wills Creek and Grapevine, he went back to Virginia and brought Harriet Taylor with him as his wife. And of course they lived on Wills Creek and Grapevine. They lived on Wills Creek when she died and when he died. She was the mother of Jacob Jr., my grandpa. She's my great-great-grandmother. Excuse me, she's my great-grandmother and Mike's great-great-grandmother. And as Mike told you, the rest of what's on the tombstone.
and her last name was Taylor.
Taylor.
Harriet Taylor.
Yeah.
And notice how the carver of the tombstone here spelled wife, W-I-E-F. This is Lori, who's using shaving cream to bring out the lettering of these old tombstones. This is the other side of the same tombstone, and it reads Victoria, daughter of F.A. and V.F. Humphreys, born July the 1st, 1891, died October the 28th, 1895. And below that it says, the sweet remembrance of the just shall last when they have turned to dust.
This is the grave, as Mike just said, Victoria, and always in family legend she was referred to as Little Victoria. And I heard about her many, many times. She died at the age of 4 and was buried here with her aunt, Harriet. She was the daughter of Holt. Of course, they called him F.A., and the F stands for Flavius, I believe. There's 3 graves here, or 3 epithets filled on this one tombstone. That's C.S. Thad, who married Virginia Brookman, mother's aunt, and Victoria, who was Holt's daughter, and who was also, she was Virginia's daughter, because at that time Thad had died and Aunt Jenny married Holt, and they had Victoria, as we said half a dozen times, who had now died. And we think, while there's 3 graves listed on this tombstone, we think that there's a 3rd grave here where Harriet's husband, Jacob Judy Humphreys, was buried, though there's no reference to him on the marker. And of course, he died much later than she.
And
so we believe that we have 4 relatives in this little plot right here.
And Jacob Judy would have been Jacob Jr.'s father, the grandfather of Eric Vinton Humphreys.
Yeah.
The sweet remembrance of the just shall flourish when they sleep in dust.
Family here? Uh-huh.
Well, his half-brother and sister. Jenny.
Uncle Clement also thinks that here in this same grave area, Jacob Judy Humphreys would have been born, so there would be 4 graves here. Jacob Judy Humphreys, buried here in this spot, would be Mike Humphreys and all the cousins' great-great-grandfather on the Humphrey side. 2 final notes about this grave site, and that is that no less an authority than Doc Humphreys, who was Eric Vinton Humphreys' brother and the son of Jacob Jr. Humphreys, stated that his grandfather was buried here in this same plot, apparently without a marker. That would have been Jacob Judy Humphreys, was also buried here, so there are 4 Humphreys graves in this location. To find this tombstone, you need to come up to the Reynolds graveyard from the location that we talked about, the intersection of 119 and the road over to Interstate 79. Come up the graveyard, find the largest obelisk in the downhill side of George Given Reynolds, and then walk and come to this tombstone commemorating 3 Humphreys. This graveyard is marked by some very large cypress trees, and we're now going to walk up the hill to the Brookmans' grave site, where Uncle Clement and Lori Jean are. We're now standing at the grave of Louis Brookman,
Grandma Liddy,
who was the father of Grandma Liddy, and his grave marker says, Louis Brookman, July the 4th, 1870 to April the 3rd, 1896. And he died 2 years after Grandma Liddy was born. As a very young man, died from pneumonia.
Grandpa Humphreys told me that he sat with Grandpa Brookman while he died. And he said that Grandpa Brookman clapped his hands together in the fashion that we used to call shout and praise God. And he said Grandpa Humphrey said he shouted as long as he could, and when he couldn't get his hands together, he waved one hand, and he said, I want you to pay, this is what almost everybody said, almost every will is prefaced with these words, I want you to pay my just and honest debts, and take what is left for my wife and my little children. Now when he died, he had mother, she was 2 years old. He had Carrie, who would be about 4 years old, and Hattie, who would be about 6 years old. Now, this is all in writing someplace, and I'm not sure of that sequence. He had those 3 children, and then Grandma was, his Grandma Elizabeth James Brookman was pregnant with Addie. And since Grandma Brookman, they said she just went crazy when he died and just walked from the house to the barn and up and down the steps wringing her hands and crying for days. And it was so bad that Grandpa Brookman sold out and moved to Charleston. And then when Addie was born, they took Addie to Charleston and raised her as a city girl. Mother has told me about, how well dressed Addie was and all those things when she came to the Wills Creek to visit, but they still maintained a relationship and knowledge of each other after they were women. Now when Grandpa Brookman died, Grandpa Bert and Grandma were married soon after, and he made a home for my mother and Hattie and Carrie, along with his children. I've explained all of these things in a little brochure that I put together about the family. Mike has just reminded me that I forgot to tell you an important incident that occurred as Grandpa Brookman was dying. His last words were, according to Grandpa Humphreys, I see Jesus in heaven on the right hand of God the Father. And he died.
Well, that's a wonderful testimony, because that means he died in the faith. Next to the grave of Lewis Brookman is the grave of his father and mother, William I. Brookman. William L. Brookman, thank you, born August the 14th, 1836, and died July the 5th, 1915. The inscription says he died as he lived, a Christian. And Adeline V. Brookman, born February the 11th, 1844, and there is no date of death on her tombstone.
Okay, now this Grandma Brookman was a nailer, Adeline Naylor, and Grandpa married her after his first wife died, and they had Lewis, their only child, and she had great difficulty when Lewis Brookman died, and Grandpa then moved to Charleston. Grandpa Brookman was a relatively wealthy man, and you can go to the Kanawha County Courthouse and look at just page after page of buildings and lots that he owned in Charleston. He used to, my mother said, that he used to get up in the morning and dress and walk up to the triangle, what is known now as the Triangle on Lee Street, That's where the Capitol building was in those days, and sit there in that little park or around the Capitol and whittle and discuss politics with his friend because he didn't have to work. He had the money. And when he died, he willed everything he had to his wife and to this daughter, Adeline, that they were rearing because you remember that Grandma Burdette, was pregnant with Adeline when
Lewis died.
When Lewis died, and Grandpa and Grandma Bookman raised Adeline in Charleston. I have no idea where she's buried. I never thought about it before, or why they didn't bring her here.
This is the grave site of the young lady to whom Lewis Brookman's wife was pregnant with whom when he died. Her name was Addie, and she was born September the 11th, and Lewis Brookman died in April of 1896, and she was born 6 months later. The dates are Addie L. Brookman, Lucas, September the 11th, 1896, May the 11th, 1915. The inscription reads, God in his wisdom has recalled the bloom his love had given, and though the body slumbers here, the soul is safe in heaven. She died when she was only 20 years old.
This is Aunt Addie. I've already told you about her. When Grandpa Brookman died, Grandma Brookman was pregnant with her, and Grandma, whose name also was Adeline, was greatly disturbed. So Grandpa Brookman moved away from Wilkesboro, and they took Addie and raised her as a city girl in Charleston.
This is the Jarrett Cemetery across the Elk River. We're now in the Jarrett Cemetery here at Elkview, and we've found some of the oldest graves in the family history. And this one reads, Owen Jarrett, born in memoriam, May the 20th, 1790, departed this life July the 22nd, 1852, age 62 years, 2 months and 7 days. And buried beside him is the gravestone, is his wife. And the gravestone reads, Elizabeth Vincent, wife of Owen Jarrett, born 1789, died November the 25th, 1877.
We have just come from visiting the grave of my great-great-great-grandfather, Owen Jarrett, and his wife, Sarah Vincent Jarrett, where I could not remember his relationship to my great-grandmother, Nancy Melton James, and that's why we're putting this ad on this video. Okay, I just told you that Owen Jarrett was my great-great-grandfather. I'm the son of Liddy Brookman Humphreys and Eric Humphreys. My mother, Liddy, was the daughter of Elizabeth James. Elizabeth James was the daughter of Nancy Melton James and Lewis James. Nancy Melton James was the daughter of Benjamin Melton and Sarah James.
Jarrett.
Nancy Melton was the daughter of Benjamin Melton and Sarah Jarrett. Sarah Jarrett was the daughter of Owen Jarrett and Sarah Vincent Jarrett. Okay?
This is the summer family picnic on July the 15th, 2000. Here's Randy. There's Andrew. Wave Andrew.
Hi, Stacy.
Wave at the camera, ladies.
On women, on his team.
Wave at the camera. Where's Aunt Janet? Wave at the camera. Mark, wave at the camera, buddy.
I got one call in the world. It's Josh said, I don't take care of
There you go.
And a wave. Thank you.
I'll have to wave now.